Greetings, denizens of the Empire. It's Jabara here. Much of the present-day continent of Africa is inhabited by agricultural societies, but despite this fact, there's a common misconception that Africans south of the Sahara led exclusively hunter-gatherer or nomadic pastoralist lifestyles prior to contact with European and Middle Eastern civilizations. Not only is this completely untrue, but resoundingly false. While there are some parts of Africa that have historically, and in some cases, still do lead nomadic hunter-gatherer or pastoralist lifestyles, this simply is not the case for the majority of the continent's population, past or present, and archaeological evidence has proven that agriculture was developed independently in many parts of the world, including the well-known wheat and barley cultivation in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates river system, prehistoric Chinese cultivation of rice, Mesoamerican cultivation of maize and beans, and the Andean cultivation of potatoes. However, it may come as a surprise to many that agriculture was also independently developed in West Africa. Just as Mesopotamia hosted the Fertile Crescent, or a massive crescent-shaped territory of nutrient-rich floodplains, West Africa quite literally had its own Fertile Crescent. The Niger River flows through West Africa from west to east, also in a massive crescent shape, and hosts vast expanses of fertile lands that are constantly enriched by annual floods. The oldest known crop to have been domesticated in West Africa was the yam, which was independently domesticated in the Americas and Asia as well at different times. However, the West African domestication event is believed to be the oldest, which dates back to 5000 BCE. This date could have been much earlier, but it is difficult to accurately date their cultivation as yams don't preserve very well, and the earliest harvesting implements would have been in use before the Iron Age. Thus, they would have consisted of wooden digging sticks, which also don't preserve very well. Additionally, the African mortar and pestle used for pounding yams into dishes such as fufu were also made of wood, a fact that remains true to the present day. In modern times, West Africa is often dubbed as the Yam Belt, with 95% of all of the world's yams being cultivated in the sub-Saharan African region. In fact, the English word yam is a loan word from numerous West African languages, including nyami, which means to eat in the Fulani language, and anyinam, which derives from the Twi language spoken by the Ashanti people of what is now modern-day Ghana. It is speculated that ancient West Africans discovered the idea of cultivating yams when they realized that the hard and edible head of the yam that was cut off and discarded during the preparation process would sometimes take root in or around the loose soil from whence the yam was originally harvested and grow into an entirely new tuber. Eventually, these early populations would have taken notice of this and intentionally started to plant all of the heads in an easily accessible area, eventually accumulating harvests and effectively transforming from nomadic hunter-gatherer societies with inconsistent food supplies to permanent civilizations with food security. Even more surprisingly, genetic studies of modern-day yams show that they most likely descended from the forest variety, as opposed to those that grow in the African Sahel or savanna. This is notable since most West African crops are believed to have been domesticated in the grasslands of West Africa, which are much more conducive to agriculture.
Yep, that's a load of bullshit. Primitive Negroes hunted for all their food and lived in mud huts unlike the white man who were building cathedrals.
First of all, that is some really weird logic you have there. I don't think cathedrals were ever built for anyone to live in. That's like comparing some medieval European peasants' hovels with Great Zimbabwe. Like, how's that even a proper comparison? Secondly, way to contradict yourself, Mr. Bigot. Hunter-gatherers don't live in mud huts. Mud huts are permanent structures, and therefore they are used by archaeologists as one of the main indicators of a sedentary society. In other words, they were the cornerstone of farming societies, as it meant that they could reside in the same region all year, which was only possible if they were growing their own food. Hunter-gatherers and nomads only built temporary structures like the yurts of the Mongols or the teepees of the Plains Native Americans. Doesn't really make much sense to expend a large amount of time, human labor, or calories on a permanent structure like a mud hut if you constantly have to migrate from the areas to chase around the herd. Not to mention, the archaeological record definitively shows that agriculture was independently developed in Africa, in two different regions: the Nile Valley of Northeast Africa and the Niger River of West Africa. By contrast, most European agriculture was learned from outsiders.
Hey, yep, that's right. You tell him, Jabbar. The white man was living in caves until the black man taught him everything that he know, but he always lie like it's the other way around, just stealing our history.
No, Dr. Kangs, I'm not saying that either. While there were certainly some things that Europeans learned from Africans, agriculture was not one of them. European agriculture most likely originated from the ancient cultures of the Middle Eastern and Mediterranean regions, and Africans learned things from Europeans as well. That's what makes human society constantly grow and progress, the fact that we constantly learn things from one another and build upon prior knowledge and wisdom, regardless of who did it first. And arguing over who did what first doesn't really change anything. Even if that was important, you must not conveniently forget that important and foundational discoveries like farming, metallurgy, writing systems, and gunpowder were all ideas that were imported to Europe from outside civilizations that had already discovered them, as opposed to independent development on the European continent. I just want to briefly shout out Happy Hippo Herbals for making this video possible. Happy Hippo Herbals is a provider of numerous alternative medicine products, some of which I use regularly to help me stay focused and feel less anxious in my daily life. If you use my referral link or referral code FN10, you can receive a 15% discount on all Happy Hippo Herbals products. Go to fromnothing.info/market for my affiliate link and for links to other partners that I've worked with in the past. Rice is another excellent example of an indigenous African crop domesticated in ancient times. Like the yam, rice was gathered for food or independently domesticated in different places at different times. Native Americans harvested several other rice species that we collectively know today as wild rice, but none of these were ever domesticated. While the familiar variety of rice that we primarily consume around the world today originated in prehistoric Asia around 7000 BCE, another important domestication event occurred in West Africa along the upper Niger River much more recently in roughly 1000 BCE. Not only did this domestication event occur at a different time separated by vast geographical regions, but also the wild variety in which West African rice ultimately descends from differs from that of the Asian one. Asian rice is Oryza sativa, and its wild ancestor is Oryza rufipogon, while the African variety is classified as Oryza barthi, and its wild ancestor is Oryza glaberrima. So basically, rice was domesticated at two different times on two different continents from two different species. And like the yam, rice is an excellent example of convergent evolution of agriculture. African rice continued to spread all throughout West Africa, with notable centers of diversification being along the Gambia River, Guinea-Bissau, and the forested region between Guinea, Sierra Leone, and the Ivory Coast. Interestingly enough, it is even grown in the present-day country of Suriname, where it was transported via human cargo during the transatlantic slave trade. With the exception of this, however, African rice cultivation never extended outside of West Africa. Though many traditional African dishes include rice in their recipes, they consist of the Asian varieties that made their way to the African continent by the Indian Ocean Trade Network. An unfortunate fact is that despite West Africa having its own traditional variety, it has been gradually facing displacement by Asian rice ever since it was first introduced to the region by Portuguese explorers in the 16th century, and has come to be more preferred as it produces higher grain yields. Traditional African dishes like jollof rice are almost exclusively made with Asian varieties like basmati rice. A National Research Council report points out that this should not be allowed to happen. The rice of Africa has a long and noteworthy history. This report also discusses how indigenous rice is rarely grown in West Africa anymore, mostly being restricted to rural subsistence farmers. It then mentions the rampant food shortages in Africa, and the overall reliance on foreign crops that are poorly adapted to the African environment, which only exacerbates the issue, as they are much less tolerant to the local climate and diseases, and thus much more likely to result in local famines. Lastly, we will discuss what was perhaps West Africa's earliest and most universally cultivated crop. Like other cereal crops around the world, like wheat and barley, millet has been traditionally grown for purposes of food and brewing of alcoholic beverages, with some regions using it exclusively for brewing while deriving their foodstuffs from other sources. Also, like the aforementioned yam and rice, many species of millet have been domesticated independently in various parts of the world, including China, India, East Africa, and West Africa, the latter two being finger millet and pearl millet respectively. However, since the focus of this presentation is on West Africa, we will talk about pearl millet. The wild ancestors of pearl millet are endemic throughout West Africa, and the earliest conclusive evidence of pearl millet cultivation in West Africa dates back to around 2000 BCE, while conjectural estimates of its initial domestication are suggested to be as early as 6500 BCE. The center of domestication likely rests in a region northeast of the Senegal River, in a broad area covering parts of Senegal, Mauritania, and Mali. This theory rests in the fact that the wild millet that grows there shares the most genetic similarity between all wild and domesticated varieties of West African pearl millet. In conclusion, West Africa was one of the few initial centers of the world that independently invented the practice of cultivating crops, a crucial step towards transforming dangerous and nomadic lifestyles into settled, permanent villages, and ultimately towns, cities, kingdoms, and even empires. Despite this, there is a common misconception that nomads or hunter-gatherers were primarily inhabitants of most parts of pre-colonial Africa. And while there still are some hunter-gatherer societies in some parts of Africa, their number and distribution pales in comparison to agricultural societies, even prior to contact with European explorers. Hunter-gatherers and pastoralists in Africa are restricted almost exclusively to sparsely populated deserts and dense rainforests. In other words, they inhabited places where the development of agriculture was simply difficult or impossible, and thus much less likely to develop. Agriculture is an ancient and deeply rooted way of life for the majority of the various peoples of Africa, and the three crops covered in this presentation are only among the oldest and most widespread in West Africa, and many other crops were domesticated throughout the region of West Africa alone, as well as the remainder of the continent, including some incredibly important modern world crops like coffee, a necessary component of many of our daily routines, and cola, which we use to flavor and caffeinate many of our favorite soft drinks. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you did, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. For sources, check out my website, linked below. If you'd like to support future projects, you can do so there as well, or by clicking the join button below, or by becoming a patron. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching as usual, and always remember, we don't come from nothing.